Break Fix's History of Motorsports series is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center, as well as the Society of Automotive Historians, the Watkins Glen Area Chamber of Commerce, and the Argetsinger family.
My name is Tom Wiedemann, and I'm Executive Director at the Motor Racing Research Center. Today we're going to learn about the exciting 50 years of Formula One racing at the Canadian Grand Prix, and we have three speakers with years of stories to tell. In order of appearance, we're honored to be hearing from George Webster, Lionel Birnbaum, and Tim Meadow. So let me start with George. George was a Canadian Automobile Sports Club appointee to the Stewards Committee for the Grand Prix races during the MoSport years of the early Montreal years. He was chief steward, chairing the Committee of Race Stewards from 1977 through 1980. He has attended 71 Formula One Grand Prix. George is a retired high school teacher from Oakville, Ontario. He's been working part-time as motorsports writer and photographer since the mid-1970s, and he has covered road racing, NASCAR, kart, and Formula One racing for the publications including Autosports Canada, PRN Ignition, National Speed Sport News, and the website GoRacing.com. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speakers, and we'll start with George.
So this year we're marking the 50th anniversary of the first Grand Prix of Canada. That was held at MoSport in 1967. There'd been a race every year. This would have been the 51st running, but it's actually only the 48th running because it was canceled three times, in 1975, 1987, and 2009. Cancellation has been threatened two other times that I know of. 2004, when the federal law prohibited tobacco sponsorship in the cars, completely prohibited it. And in 2017, this year, the organizers at Montreal had promised to do about $18 million worth of upgrades and had apparently done none of them. And so that the race was under question. Now they have been given a postponement for 2 years. 2019, they're supposed to do that 18 million improvements. So this year, the Canadian Post Office recognized the 50th anniversary with a commemorative set of stamps honoring 5 GP winners: Jackie Stewart, Gilles Villeneuve, Ayrton Senna, Michael Schumacher, and Lewis Hamilton. All with the exception of Gilles, they were multiple winners of a Grand Prix. I think there would have been more appropriate subjects for them to recognize the Canadian Grand Prix, but I guess this is what they thought would sell. So I attended the first Grand Prix at MoSport in '67, and I was at the 48th running 2 weeks ago. I attended all 8 GPs at MoSport, the next 6 in Montreal, and a few more since then. In all, I have attended over 70 Grand Prix here and in Europe. Despite its European origins and identity, the Formula One Grand Prix of Canada has always been, without question, the premier auto racing event in Canada. And there's no other annual sporting event of any kind in Canada that has such an international reach. What might it be? The Grey Cup, the Stanley Cup, the Brier? Only Canadians would know what that is. That's curling. As for other race events in Canada, nearly all the other major auto racing events are visiting rounds of American-based series. By contrast, here in the United States, there are many annual race events which tend to overshadow the US GP, such as the Indy 500, the Daytona 500, 24 Hours of Daytona, and so on. 1967, 50 years ago. What do we remember? Well, here's some things that come to my mind. It was Canada's centennial year. We all remember Expo 67, which was staged in Montreal and on 2 islands. Ile Notre Dame, where the Grand Prix is held, was built as an artificial island completely. The other one was Ile Sainte Helene, was partly built. I'm from Toronto. The Maple Leafs won Stanley Cup that year. Haven't won it since. Ronald Reagan inaugurated as governor of California. That's a long time ago. Probably remember that there were race riots that year in Detroit and many other U.S. cities. The Beatles released their album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Band. In the movies, we had Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate, Clint Eastman in the movie A Fistful of Dollars. On television, there was the Smothers Brothers. On Broadway, it was Cabaret, and Hair was still off-Broadway. But in our context, perhaps more significantly, was the movie Grand Prix was released late in 1966. It was in Cinerama, which is like IMAX today, and it featured amazing in-car racing footage, unlike anything we'd ever seen before. And it introduced the general public to Grand Prix racing, the circuits, the cars, the drivers, some fictional and some real. So when the Grand Prix came to MoSport in 1967, there was already a ready-built, well-informed fan base in place. British sports cars and their more humble economy sedans were very popular, and we lusted for the more expensive makes like Porsche, Jaguar, Mercedes. This was the foundation of the so-called sports car movement in Canada as well as here. The number of sports car clubs in the 50s was exploding. The Canadian Automobile Sport Clubs, or CASC, was a federation formed of member clubs across the country. especially in Ontario and Quebec. So CASC affiliated clubs that organized sports car races on the runways of former World War II air training bases beginning in the early 1950s. There were at least 5 different airfield circuits that operated in Ontario in the pre-MoSport era. We got our news from magazines like Canada Track and Traffic and Road and Track, even though their long lead times meant that the racing news was pretty stale by the time we read about it. There were weekly papers like Competition Press and Motoring News, but few Canadians read either one of those. Companies like Castrol, Shell, and BP produced racing films, which the clubs bore to show at their meetings, and there was very limited television coverage of car racing at that time. So the recent invasion of the Indy 500 by F1 stars like Jack Brabham, Clark, Gurney, Graham Hill, and Jackie Stewart had given these drivers much more visibility. Hence, we knew a lot about the recent history of sports car racing in Formula One, but we may not have been too up to date on the recent events of the current season. With the large immigrant population, especially in Toronto and Montreal, we had a built-in fan base of post-war arrivals from Britain, Germany, and especially Italy. Watkins Glen had been putting on the USGP here since 1961, and MoSport, there have been professional races since its beginning in 1961, the Players 200 and the Sports Car Canadian Grand Prix, and at Saint-Jovite, as we called it then, they also ran professional sports car races. In 1966, both those circuits hosted rounds of the first year of the Can-Am Series. Gerald Donaldson, who has become Canada's premier Formula One writer, wrote a definitive history of the early years of the Canadian Grand Prix, and I found this book to be a valuable resource. The photos I'm using today have been scanned from contemporary publications. Many of those photos are credited to Lionel, who you're going to hear from next, and I know he's going to be using some of the same photos I'm using in his presentation. And thanks to Bill Green for the use of his program collection, which I've made good use of. By 1967, we were ready to welcome a proper Formula One Grand Prix to Canada. Early in the decade, there had been a couple unsuccessful attempts to get a Formula One race in Canada, one to be a championship event and one to be a championship round, but those attempts failed. The 1967 event was approved as a one-off event in recognition of our centennial year. Both MoSport and Saint-Jovite wanted the event, but it went to MoSport. So here's the starting lineup for the 67 race. There were 18 entries. There were 2 Canadians and 2 Americans in addition to Dan Gurney. That is, only 14 Formula One regulars, and few of those had proper 3-liter engines as allowed by the 1966 rules going into 67. The new Lotus 49 with the new Cosworth Ford DFV engine had won the pole and the race in its inaugural race, the Dutch GP, a few weeks earlier. This engine was to revolutionize and dominate Formula One racing for the next several years, but I doubt many people at MoSport had any concept of how significant this engine was, even though these Lotus cars proved to be the fastest in qualifying. That's the point I was making about the fact we got our news from Road and Track, which is months old, years old sometimes. The other potential winner was the Brabham Repco, the champion car from the previous year. It's a light car with a reliable stock block V8 engine. Others like Ferrari, Maserati, and BRM had gone down the wrong track, building big, heavy, and often unreliable engines. The rest of the car entries in the main were using bored-out engine from the previous 1.5-liter rules, trying to run in a 3-liter class, or from the even older 2.5-liter rules that ended in 1960. So here's the starting grid. The 2 Lotuses who are on the front row to the left there out of frame. That's Denny Holmes, Brabham, Repco in the front there. It was a rainy day, started in the rain, note the spray. Also note that Clark is already 3 or 4 car lengths out ahead of everybody else, with Hill behind him and Hulme off to the side there. Later in the race, here's some more spray. That's Gurney leading the eventual winner, Jack Brabham. Gurney ended up lapped down, so this is probably taken at the point when he was being lapped. The 2 Lotus cars were the fastest, but they had troubles in this race. Notably, the ignition shorted out when the rain came down. And the Brabhams, who were on good years, had a better pace when the surface was wet. Second half of the race, the rain came down quite heavily, and Lotuses were done for. Most of the drivers made pit stops to try to get dry goggles. Only Jack Brabham had a relatively uneventful day. He cruised home to win by a margin of more than a full minute over his teammate Denny Hulme, the only other driver to finish all 90 laps. Gurney was third, a lap down. There were 12 finishers, 5 DNFs. The 2 Brabhams ended up winning, even though we consider them to be kind of underclass cars. They had won the championship the previous year, and they were to go on to win the championship in 67 as well. Best result for a Canadian driver went to LPs, who only completed 47 laps. LPs gets a lot of bad press. I remember LPs from when I got started in the latter part of the 50s. And in Ontario, he was a really well-respected driver. He drove MGA Twin Cam, MGB, Lotus 23, and was a successful driver. People tend to think he was over his head with this car. It was a car that had an old 4-cylinder Climax engine. I don't think it was well prepared, and I think he just had a lot of bad luck. But it's unfortunate because LP's, his name is mud when it comes to Formula One. So it may not have been a classic race by any measure, but it was our Grand Prix, and it was our first F1 Grand Prix, and that makes it iconic in the history of Canadian motorsport. Bob Hanna was one of the key figures, among many, in making this event a success, and he continued to play a key role as CASC's executive director until its unfortunate demise in 1987. He's sort of Canada's Cameron Argensinger. Cameron, of course, had many different important roles in the development of sports car racing in the U.S. here and Formula One. And Bob was there right through to 87 when CSC was booted, and he lost that role. Fortunately, he landed on his feet with another role. I'm going to skip from there to Montreal and do the 2 years together. Lionel's more familiar with these years than I am. Key thing was, up until then, CSC was not an ASN in its own right, only had the right as a affiliate of the RAC in Britain, and that's why the racing colors were green like Britain's. There was a problem for Britain to get a second Grand Prix, even if it was another continent. So after the 67 event, the FIA granted CSC full ASN status and the right to stage an annual Grand Prix. And incidentally, at the same time, CSC changed its racing colors from green with white stripes to red with a white stripe. Racing colors kind of went out of style in those days. A lot of people aren't even aware of that. In this era of rapprochement between English and French communities in Canada, the decision was made to alternate the Grand Prix between Quebec and Ontario. That was happening in Britain between Brands Hatch and Silverstone, for example. So here's the first race at Saint-Jovite, hosted the first Can-Am race of all Can-Am races in 1966. Notice that they recycled the artwork from the year before, and the official name down at the bottom there is Circuit Mont-Tremblant Saint-Jovite. It had limited space in the paddock and the pits and limited vantage spots for the spectators. More importantly, it had a two-lane road coming up from Montreal. Jackie Ickx was driving for Ferrari that year. He crashed in practice and broke his leg. Our Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, was a very popular Prime Minister, flew in by helicopter. I think that was exciting in itself. He waved the flag to start the race, and he stayed engaged to the end of the race. He presented as a real fan. Rindt started from the pole in a Brabham Repco, but Chris Amon led the first 72 laps in his Ferrari. This is the only time when the cars had the high wings in Canada. And the 1967 champion, Denny Hulme, starting from the third row, was the winner in McLaren Ford. I'm going to skip a year forward to 1970, after a year back in MoSport, where they put the picture of the new Tyrrell Ford 001. It was much anticipated, although nobody had ever seen one on a racetrack, on the cover. George Eaton, who is a sign of the Eaton department store family, the most important department store chain in Canada by far, bought a ride with BRM for a season and a bit, but he had limited success. He finished 10th here at Saint-Jovite, and that was his best ever result. By the way, Lance Stroll's 9th place in this year's Canadian GP was the best result ever for a Canadian driver, other than the two Villeneuve, Gilles and Jacques. Stewart in the Tyrrell showed up at the race. He qualified in the pole. He led for the first 31 laps, and he was motoring off into the distance, says Donaldson. On lap 32, he retired with a broken front stub axle. Remember, this was the great new car. The next two races here at the Glen and at the Mexican Grand Prix, he retired as well. There's Ickx, 1980. He inherited the lead after Stewart retired, and he ran the race by 15-second margin over Regazzoni and the other Ferrari. Chris Amon in a March was the only other driver to finish in the lead lap. A year in between, 69, and then we jumped to 71 through 77 at MoSport. So this is the 69 interstitial race at MoSport. Jackie Ickx won the pole in his Brabham Ford, while Jackie Stewart was fourth fastest in his Matra car with a Ford engine. Ickx led from the start, but Stewart had caught him by the fifth lap, and he took the lead. After that, Ickx hounded Stewart, and on lap 33 of the 90-lap race, Ickx made an impossible move to duck inside Stewart, coming over the crest into the second turn. If you know MoSport at all, that's the trickiest possible corner, and nobody should try to make this maneuver, coming over the crest into two. They collided. Stewart spun off and out of the race, while Ickx kept on going. Not a very popular guy. He won the race by a margin of 36 seconds over Jack Brabham in the other Brabham car. Rindt in a Lotus was the only other driver to finish in the lead lap. So after this, the GP returned to Saint-Jovite in 70, and then it came back to MoSport in 71. Notice that players still like recycling the artwork. And also notice the name, Players Grand Prix Canada. To me, that's significant because that's not English, it's not French. In French, it would be Grand Prix du Canada Players, but it should be Grand Prix du Canada. And in English, they call it Grand Prix of Canada to try to have the parallelism. So I think this was an attempt to just fudge over that. 71, my biggest memory was something I never saw. I was down at corner 5. There's a driver by the name of Wayne Kelly, who's, I guess, from the Ottawa area, who was a very popular driver and looked destined for stardom, at least within Canada. He was killed in an on-track accident during the Formula Ford race when he came over the crest between corners 1 and 2, ran into an ambulance, parked on the track, and was killed instantly. When I question, do we really need these full course yellows on a road course, this incident would be one of the major arguments early on to say we've got to do something. Something is full course yellow. I hate those full course yellows on a road course, but I think this Wayne Kelly incident was one of the ones that is in the history of that. So there was a long delay under Ontario law. The coroner had to be dispatched and he had to do whatever he does. By the time we were ready to start the Grand Prix, it started raining. So then they had delay over that, but over 2 hours before the race got started. Wasn't such a big problem in the pre-television days. By lap 60 of the 80 laps, the rain had turned to fog and darkness, so the race was flagged off after just 64 laps. Stewart and Peterson had shared the lead, but Stewart led the final 33 laps to take the checker. Peterson was second in the march, while Mark Donoghue was third. Here's my friend George Eaton again, finished 15th, and it was his last race with BRM, and kind of his last race ever. By this time, he'd pretty well run through his inheritance, I believe. The department store, by the way, is long since defunct. It's not just George Eaton that's lost out, but he'd used his inheritance in racing. Maybe it was a good idea because I guess the rest of the family just lost it through bankruptcy of the company. For 72, back at MoSport, CSC made the decision not to return to San Jovita as originally planned. It had been proved to be an unviable business proposition. Not enough spectators could get up that two-lane road on race day. From my perspective, which was as a member of the national executive, I see that decision was essentially a CASC decision, even though most people try to place the blame elsewhere. Ultimately, CASC just pulled the plug and said, we have lost a pile of money, whether players bailed them out or whether they had to bail themselves out. But CASC was on the hook for a huge amount of money and never went back to San Jovita. So CSC found a permanent home at MoSport and came back in 72. Publication was produced, I guess, after the event. This is a driver's meeting, and I find it interesting, partly because I recognize most of the people, not just the drivers, but friends of mine are in that picture as well. This is at the foot of the tower as you go into the control towers. Anybody who wandered along could kind of cozy up at the back and listen in to the driver's meeting. So this race was also delayed by fog. Peterson led Stewart had started from the second row, but after just 3 laps, he got passed for the lead and drove off in the distance, and he won the race. Peterson continued to drive in his dramatic style, but he collided with Graham Hill, who he was lapping, and ended his day. Peter Revson, who was a rookie that year in Formula One, finished second in a Yardley McLaren. In those days, you didn't have these half a second or 3-second gaps. 48 seconds back to second place. Hulme was third, also in McLaren. 1973, interesting year. It was wet at the start, and I was sitting in the grandstand across from the pits as a spectator. And the thing that struck me most of all was this guy who started on the 4th row, dropped the flag, and he's gone right into the first corner. I think he led into the first corner. Nicky Lauda in his second year in Formula One, first year with BRM. He did a lot better with BRM than George Eaton did. Part of it had to do with the fact they were on Firestone tires and a lot of the others were in Goodyears, and the Firestone rain tires seemed to be superior. In the wake of some serious accidents which had been inadequate rescue procedures, for example, the Roger Williamson fatality at Zandvoort earlier that year, the responsible officials had been talking about using a full course yellow in a Grand Prix for some time. And then they had actually made a test run at an earlier event in the year. But this time it actually came to pass. Scheckter and Sever tried to run side by side down into turn 2. Remember that with Eakes and Stewart? And Sever was crashed out of the race. Scheckter continued. This was Sever's final race. Watkins Glen people know this. 1973, Sever here was killed in practice. So he never started the race here. But this accident with the service vehicles that were out partially blocked the track, so they called out Eppie Wietz's in the pace car. Unfortunately, in that era of handmade lap charts, no one was quite sure who the leader was after most of the cars had pitted to change off their rain tires. So they told Eppie to pick up Howden Gaddenly. I don't know why they thought he was the leader. I think he was a lap down. So he came out in the middle of the lap. If the pace car comes out in the middle of the pack, the guys who are in front come around and make up a lap, and the people who are behind are trapped. So Fittipaldi was trapped behind Ganley, and these other guys come and they come around. But the key people, who were the race control people, weren't sure or didn't know how to fix it. After the pace car was called in, the racing resumed, confusion continued. So here's the scoreboard at lap 80, the end of the race. That's Fittipaldi, number 1. Number 2 is Ganley. Number 3 is Revson. Number 4 is Beltoise. Understandably, Colin Chapman thought his guide won the race. He runs out in the track, throws his hat up in the air, but there was no checker. Starters standing there. Finally, this group with Ganley, Halewood, Revson, and Hunt come around, and out comes the checker. And so they ushered these 3 guys, Fittipaldi, Revson, and Oliver, to the podium. And they stood there with bemused expressions on their face, and the trophy was handed to Rebs, and they finally got a new Maple Leaf trophy there. So in the hours that followed, the lap scorers were able to recheck their work using the tapes they've been marked with the car numbers as they pass. It takes a few moments before the information written on the tapes is transferred to the actual lap chart. But it is an accurate, if a little bit slow, method. So in the end, after they went through some hours of double checking, triple checking, they verified that Revson was the race winner, Fittipaldi was second, and Oliver third. So it appears that when they took them to the podium, they already had a pretty good rough version of this hand lap chart based on the tapes. I think there's about a maximum delay in that process of about a lap. So they knew, but nobody was going to believe them until they went and spent hours doing it. Beltoise was 4th, and Ganley was 6th. So it's no surprise that in F1 they got cold feet about the pace car. This is 73, and it wasn't until 93 that they finally came back and established what we now know as the safety car procedure. And of course, computerized lap scoring had been established for a long time by then. So we all know now that the lap score, as soon as the car crosses the line, sometimes I find it confusing. Sometimes they are updating halfway around the lap. So 1974, this is significant in that we have Andretti in a Parnelli, American-made car, and Donahue in a Penske, another American car. There's the podium with Fittipaldi, the winner, Peterson, and Regazzoni. He left here tied in championship points with Regazzoni, who had finished in 2nd place. Fittipaldi finished 4th here 2 weeks later, but that was good enough to give him the title. 1975, nothing happened, but everything happened. In the iconic points in the history of the Canadian Grand Prix, this is one of the big ones. So there was no Grand Prix. Bernie Ecclestone, who had come in as the owner of the Brabham team, had talked all the garages, that's basically everybody but Ferrari, into having him negotiate a collective agreement on their behalf. He was starting to turn the screw. He was involved in negotiations with both MoSport and Watkins Glen in August of 75. He set a deadline. This is Bernie's stuff. There's a deadline. That's it. No compromises. I don't know what was going on, but the MoSport people dithered a little bit and didn't meet the midnight deadline. Mel Curry saw what was going to happen and decided he would accept Bernie's terms. So he accepted Bernie's terms. MoSport people got up the next morning. Bernie said, well, there's going to be a Grand Prix at Watkins Glen and there's not going to be a Grand Prix at MoSport. Tough. I think that's exactly what Bernie wanted because he only lost one date off the calendar, but he had an object lesson that stood for every other Grand Prix organizer he was negotiating with. Do what I say or you're screwed. I'm not going to compromise. Anybody else would have said, they come in the next morning and said, sorry, we were confused. We'll sign now. Where do I sign? If you're buying a car, you come in the next day and you said, yeah, I decided that was the price here. Where do I sign? He would have said, yeah, fine, you got a car. Bernie said, screw you. Because MoSport was committed to run the date and they advertised it and they had all the sport races organized, they still ran the race without the Grand Prix and they call it the Grand Prix. Terrible. One of the worst days of weather I've seen for a race event. So we get to 76. At the start, Peterson is leading Hunt, but notice that they've got the low airbox and not the high airbox. Hunt took the lead on the 9th lap and basically drove home. Gerald Donaldson wrote, Hunt won in convincing style, but there was a great interest in Nicky Lauda, the leader of the World Championship, in only his second race after his near-fatal Nürburgring crash. He finished 8th between Carlos Pace, who had a wild entanglement with Clay Regazzoni in front of the pits, 3 laps from the end of the race. So I was one of the stewards for that event, and Bernie decided he was going to protest that Regazzoni had caused that crash and hurt his driver's chances and so on. Regazzoni only spoke Italian in the meeting, so we had to translate everything, but he sometimes would forget and answer before the question was translated. So anyway, we ruled that this was a racing incident, that it's a pretty common occurrence that you came into corner 10 and you overcook it. It gets loose and you go wham straight into the pit wall or almost into it. Bobby Rahal had a really big crash there in the Can-Am car. Anyway, we said, no, we're not going to play your game, Bernie. You deal with that. It had something to do also, I think, with who was contracted to who the following years. So 77 was the final year at MoSport. Labatt's had already made the decision to go to another venue the following year. Aside from that, I don't think there would ever have been another Grand Prix at MoSport after 77, even if they hadn't already made the decision. Because on Friday, Ian Ashley took off the back straight, and I think he got about as high as the ceiling before he landed. He landed, hit the top of a television tower. Turned out that the rescue procedures were solely lacking. Big point they made was that they had promised they would have a helicopter ambulance on site, and they didn't. You know, you got a couple marshals. Marshals are not trained to deal with an incident like that. You know, they're not expected to deal with it. But basically, they went in there with hacksaws, and the team pit crew rescued him. Terrible, terrible. People were really, really upset at that. So that was enough. So the next day, Jochen Maas, coming out of one up here, overcooks it, hits the guardrail. Guardrail falls over. They look at the posts, and they're rotten. I think then probably the drivers back in the garage were saying, are we going to run? Are we going to pack it in now? So there was a lot of talk. I've read a couple of different reports of how this transpired. What I do know, because I was in the tower, from my vantage point in the tower, I do know that the clerk of the course, Paul Cook, agreed to a request to drive James Hunt around the track, and he interviewed marshals. What are your qualifications? What is your experience? As if that had something to do with James Hunt. I was livid. As far as I'm concerned, Paul Cook should have said to him, the FIA has inspected this course and approved it. If you have a beef, talk to the FIA. You can't wait to talk to the FIA, talk to the stewards. But the fallout would have been that the track would never have been approved again for an F1 course. Little known fact, again, I was in the tower, and I was in the tower during lunch hour when there was hardly anybody there. The telephone communication system was, I say unreliable in my notes, but it was out. There was no communication system. But the whole of lunch hour, from the time we stopped, whatever we were doing before lunch, to about 15 minutes before the green for the Formula One race, we had no telephone communications. I was the chief steward, and so I was rehearsing my lines to say, there will be no race. You will not drop the green flag. Fortunately, I think it's fortunate, I didn't have to do that. I think everybody dropped the ball on that, including the FIA. I don't think they should have approved it. If the course was that bad, they shouldn't have approved it. And they should have had an inspector there for the race. On the bright side, Gilles Villeneuve had been signed with McLaren, and he went to Silverstone in 77 in the end of June, July. And he had a really good run, really excellent run. He finished 11th, but had he not pitted because he thought his car was overheating, probably would have finished 7th. Really excellent run, better than Jochen Maas, his teammate at that time. He had a contract. McLaren had also tested Patrick Tambay, who is a good driver. They went with Tambay for whatever reason. So here's Villeneuve, just out of luck, just beach. So Chris Amon, who had been responsible for the Dallara Wolf Formula One car in 77, the same year, he called up Enzo Ferrari, who he worked with, who he'd driven for, and said, hire Villeneuve. And they did. They hired him with a full-time contract as of 78. So when they got to Canada in 77, they had a third car for him. This was his debut with Ferrari, right there, that 21 car. Lauda had clinched the championship the week before here, and he was going to go to another team. He was going to go to Brabham. As I understand it, they unceremoniously fired his mechanic here because he was going with him to Brabham. They just said, so Ferrari, before they left the track here, said, forget it, you're done. So Lauda was totally pissed, and he said, I'm done. That's it. And he says, and on top of that, I'm not going to run, you're running 3 cars, you're not going to provide proper support. I think that was just bullshit. But anyway, he said that. You're running 3 cars, I'm not going to run them if you're running 3 cars. So he didn't show up. Ferrari tried to protest Lauda because he had been entered in the event and withdrawn without giving enough notice. Well, the team owner can't protest his own driver. I don't think that's possible. Well, anyway, that's what we thought. We couldn't see any way that Ferrari could protest Lauda because Ferrari was the entrant, not Lauda. They were really protesting themselves. So we just said, forget that. Villeneuve was running about 9th. He spun off in oil and turned 9, and he retired. He had finished 11th in the McLaren at Silverstone. This is 77. Okay, that marshal on the ground, his name is Ernie Strong. So I was in the tower. Hunt was coming around trying to catch Andretti, who was leading. He came up past Moss. I still can't quite figure out. I think Moss was a lap down, but he finished on the lead lap, so I don't know how that happened. Anyway, he came by to go by Moss, and there was a miscommunication about which side he should have gone on, and he got knocked off. He hit the guardrail pretty heavily and was kind of trapped in. He had to leave a shoe behind to get out. Ernie went, pull him out. Hunt is out. He's presumably a bit dazed if he's been that had much impact, and he starts to walk towards the track. Eddie Marshall's trained to know that driver might be confused when he gets out of the car. You've got to really kind of watch that they don't do something stupid. When they start to walk towards the track, you're going to restrain them. And if that doesn't work, you're going to restrain them a bit stronger. Ernie goes to stop them from walking towards the track. I now know from reading the biographies that Hunt is tremendously volatile. So he just swings. Tremendous haymaker. Knocks Ernie strong to the ground, flat to the ground. As stewards, after the race we dealt with it, Hunt was long gone. But we unanimously agreed to give him the maximum fine. It wasn't much. It was 1,000 Swiss francs, which was kind of a joke now. That's the worst we could do to him. We were really upset about it. So anyways, it turned out Andretti was leading 78 of the laps, but he stopped for lack of oil pressure. Jody Scheckter, who was driving this Wolf car, which was running in Canadian livery. Walter Wolf's Austrian who made a lot of money hauling materials at Expo 67. So we were pretty happy that a Canadian car won that race. Scheckter had won twice before in that car. Even though he had 7 retirements that year, he finished second behind Lauda in the championship standing. So if I'd bought a program that year, which I didn't, I would have discovered this graphic in the program, which said next year's race is at Toronto's exhibition place. That's where the Indy, now called Honda Indy, is held. And it's more or less that layout. So that was Labatt's plan, was they were going to go to Toronto and they were going to have it there. There had been an earlier plan to do that by a different promoter, and people from MoSport had raised so much hell that they got the locals all riled up and they convinced the councillors to vote it down. So they come back here about 5 years later and they want to run their own race, the Grand Prix. Well, those people remembered all those horror stories they've been told and they convinced their councillors to turn it down. The story goes, the next day, Jean Drapeau, Montreal's mayor, got on the phone to Labatt's and said, well, let's go to Montreal. There's a lot of legend in that. But no question, it went to Montreal. It's the same circuit, 2 different names. Obviously, it became Gilles Villeneuve after his death. And it's still there this year. And it looks like it's going to be there for quite a while. Despite the little glitches, the contract with now called F1 Group, Formula One Group, has been extended to 2029. And between the 3 levels of government, the promise of $100 million, which sounds like a lot, but in a way over that many years, 15 years is actually not that much. Here's the site of Expo 67, and that's where they built the track. Most of the buildings, if not all of them, are still there. The track portion, this is the rowing basin back here. This is where the pits are now. This is kind of a lake that's still there. This building is now the casino. That was the French pavilion. This was the Quebec pavilion. It's now been seemingly converted to be an extension of the casino. Pretty well everything else you see, with the exception of the U.S. pavilion, this dome, and the bridge itself is gone. Anyway, the track came along here, it went back up around this lake, and it came back along here under this bridge, deked like that, came up around. These buildings were pretty well gone. And then came around back like that. So Roger Pert, he was a CASC officer and he was commissioned to find a location of the new circuit. An obvious choice was Ile Notre Dame, and that's an artificial island built for Expo 67. This whole island here was artificial. So it was used also for Expo 67 and the 76 Olympics for the rowing. This location has proven to be an ideal one for the Canadian Grand Prix. And even though I'm not a big admirer of Roger Pert, I think this is a major achievement on his part. And I think that we can all be proud of his achievement and congratulate him for it. 78. Andretti had won the championship that year with the revolutionary ground effects Lotus 79. I meant to say this earlier, but the Cosworth engine made the 70s the greatest period in Formula One because everybody had the same engine, it was competitive, and even though there were a couple other engines, the Cosworth engine was a winning engine, so many teams were very closely matched and there were lots of different winners. Ground effects was the next revolution. Lotus came up with it first, Andretti won in 79, and he'd already won the championship by then. However, you may also remember that when Andretti won the championship, he won it after Ronnie Peterson died as a result of an accident at Mons in the preceding race. Andretti became immediately the champion because Peterson was no longer a competitor. They got Jean-Pierre Jarier to drive the Peterson car, and he put it right in the front row with Jody Scheckter there. But here's Gilles. This is his first year, full year with Ferrari. He's in the second row, the third fastest car. And Andretti, his car never ran properly. He's way back here. Jarier and Scheckter come firing off the front row. Number 12 in the middle. The next row back, there's Villeneuve. Jones got ahead of Jarier, but he had a slow puncture, which moved Jarier up to the lead. Scheckter was in second, Villeneuve was third. Mid-race, Villeneuve passed Scheckter to take second. That was like the second coming when he got into second place. Huge roar. Jarier continued, was dominant, but he retired with an oil leak, and it left Villeneuve in no opposition. He continued to take his first career win in his home race ahead of Scheckter, with Reutemann running third. Nobody cares that if Jerry hadn't dropped out that he would have won. Villeneuve won the race, the greatest Canadian racing hero ever, engraved in stone forever. I just say in my notes, and the crowd went wild. It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. Before he came around the next time on the cool-off lap, that fence was down, totally down. And the crowd was coming straight out on the edge of the track. They knew the car's still on the track. They came out to the edge of the track, streamed across. So there's the results. The only one that counts is Villeneuve won. That's it. We don't care about anything else. Here's my picture, which shows Gilles, the Prime Minister, and the man in the hat, who's sort of responsible for it all, Jean Drapeau, the mayor of Montreal. Very controversially, all of these. He'd made Expo 67 happen, the Olympics, and this race. Outsiders from outside Montreal thought, how much money is spent? How much of my money has gone into this? And Olympic Stadium, they took 30 years to pay for, and so on. But I think in Montreal, he was always a beloved figure. He said that Expo 67 can no more lose money than I can get pregnant. Well, it lost money big time. Here's the magazine I was writing for, Autosport Canada, and it's a composite picture. But to me, that kind of represents the iconic form of the Canadian Grand Prix, of the 78 Grand Prix of Villeneuve, Montreal, US Dome, the skyline in the background. This is sort of the impression that's imprinted. Pete Lyons wrote in the magazine he was writing for at the day, the Disney-esque victory of Villeneuve must have cemented the future of the GP in the minds of Quebecois for many years to come. How true. So the development of the circuit on Ile Notre Dame was the right track in the right place, right up against the city. Despite changing ideas of what F1 track should be like, this track has aged well over the years, and Montreal has become a destination city for F1 fans. And with Gilles' popular win in 78 and his success in subsequent years, although he never won the championship, of course, he has indeed made the Grand Prix of Montreal a great piece of Canadian heritage. And this 78 race is the iconic Canadian Grand Prix. Jumping ahead to 87, there was no race in 87. This had to do with conflict over sponsorship. Labatt had been the sponsor, signed a contract with CASC. Somebody else had signed a contract with Molson. Bernie wanted to go with Molson because there was more money, I think. So he refused to bring the cars to Montreal when there was Labatt sponsorship. So there was no race. There was a race in 88 under Molson sponsorship. Some other good came from this. CASC was disenfranchised and a new ASN was created. We have an ASN that's basically Bernie's puppet. No other really fair way of explaining it. ASN we have, Roger Pert is the chair, and part of my enmity towards him, is basically Bernie's puppet. And a man by the name of Terry Lovell, who wrote a book called Bernie's Game, he says the FIA arranged the setting up of what was effectively his own, Bernie's, National Sporting Authority. And nothing has changed. I don't think even with Bernie retiring from Formula One management, I think he still controls the ASN. I won't say any more for fear of being accused of libel. I could say some more libelous things than that. The good part about it was Bernie got what he wanted, and he wanted to have a race in Montreal, and he wanted to make a lot of money out of it, and so everybody's happy but me and the CASC loyalists. One of the things that we did get, they moved the pits. So during 87, when there was no race going on, they built the new pit complex, which was a much better location. The only problem with that was the pit exit came out kind of awkwardly in the middle of that straight, which was a bad idea. I don't know quite how that happened. Those are the years that I was most involved. My involvement really after Gilles was killed with Formula One, for a number of reasons, became much less. There's been a lot of history since then. That's my version of it. And I'm going to introduce Lionel, who's going to come up and take over for me.
This episode is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center. Its charter is to collect, share, and preserve the history of motorsports, spanning continents, eras, and race series. The center's collection embodies the speed, drama, and camaraderie of amateur and professional motor racing throughout the world. The center welcomes serious researchers and casual fans alike to share stories of race drivers, race series, and race cars captured on their shelves and walls and brought to life through a regular calendar of public lectures and special events. To learn more about the center, visit www.racingarchives.org. This episode is also brought to you by the Society of Automotive Historians. They encourage research into any aspect of automotive history. The SAH actively supports the compilation and preservation of papers, organizational records, print ephemera, and images to safeguard, as well as to broaden and deepen the understanding of motorized, wheeled land transportation through the modern age and into the future. For more information about the SAH, visit www.autohistory.org.
We hope you enjoyed another awesome episode of Break Fix Podcast, brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved, be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Grand Touring Motorsports. And if you'd like to learn more about the content of this episode, be sure to check out the follow-on article at gtmotorsports.org. We remain a commercial-free and no annual fees organization through our sponsors, but also through the generous support of our fans, families, and friends through Patreon. For as little as $2.50 a month, you can get access to more behind-the-scenes action, additional pit stop minisodes, and other VIP goodies, as well as keeping our team of creators fed on their strict diet of Fig Newtons, gummy bears, and Monster. So consider signing up for Patreon today at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. And remember, without you, none of this would be possible.